Lovely. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon and welcome back. And my thanks to Savas, Robin, and the chairs and speakers in plenary sessions 1 and 2 this morning, which I do hope you enjoyed as much as I do. They have set a very high standard indeed, which I have no doubt we will maintain this afternoon. But will we get a reference to Churchill, I wonder? We've had 2 this morning, which is unusual in a BCO conference, I must say, but a little bit extra for you there. Now, our first session this afternoon will examine how the property and construction industries can reach net zero, perhaps the single most important issue we all face. But is the vision of a net zero carbon building and city no more than an aspiration, a mirage built on false foundations and technological fantasies? To explore that and introduce his panel, please welcome the chair of the BCO's Environmental, Social and Governance Group and Chief Executive of the Social Value Portal, Guy Battle.
Thank you very much. Richard, thanks very much. Absolute pleasure to be here. So we're here to discuss net zero carbon buildings. And as Richard said, is it a reality or mirage? And it's going to be interesting to see. And there's going to be some polls, by the way. We've got 3 polls. So please get your Slidos ready, because there's nothing worse than us picking up a poll, asking you to do it, and no one answers the question. So if you get online now, Slido, then we can all be ready. And I've got a few minutes, and there's going to be 2 polls, one asking you a question and the other asking you about the biggest challenges, which you'll be able to get onto at the moment. And so we're going to discuss, this issue around net zero carbon buildings. And, is it a reality or is it a mirage? What are we going to do about the gas that is still there? We might be able to get to net zero carbon in our electricity supply, but what about how we deal with the heating? What about the tenant in all of this? Are we going to engage the tenant in net zero, or are we just going to say it's landlord's problem? What about existing buildings, perhaps even our biggest challenge? What about the embodied carbon issue within this? Because if we're really talking about net zero, we can't just talk about operational carbon. We must address the issue of embodied carbon, not least because as our grid decarbonises, the embodied carbon, relative carbon footprint will increase to 40, 50, even 60, 70% of the total lifetime of that building. So, when we talk about zero carbon, we need to understand what we're going to be doing there and how we're going to do that. So I'm going to be joined in a moment by 4 very distinguished panelists, where each of the panelists is going to get up and give us a 5 to 7 minute sort of overview just to get the conversation going, and then we're going to all step back onto the panel and have a discussion. 4 panelists. I've got Jane Wakiwaka from Crown Estate, and Jane is the Director of Environmental Sustainability at the Crown Estate. We've got David Richards, who is the Director of Sustainability at Atelier 10, and David's going to bring the engineering side of things. We've got John Wright, architect, and John is the Director at Stride Treglown, and we've also got Adam Smith, who is the Project Director of Sustainability at Stanhope. So a fantastic sort of range. I'm going to start off with just definitions, because what tends to happen, if you do the next slide, please, in fact, I'll do that. What tends to happen is that we end up with a bloody great debate around net zero and how to define it. And we thought we'd just get it out of the way, say this is our definition, right, rather than worrying about it. So there's 2 parts to the definition. The first part is in operation, and the second part is embodied. There are various steps about reducing and reusing, and you finally get to offsetting. So this is built on the UK Green Building Council, so we're not intending to move away from this. And you've got these 5 basic steps, which is establish scope, and we're going to say both of those in construction and in operation. You reduce the construction impacts, you reduce the operational energy use through better design and through renewables. You maximise renewables on-site and potentially off-site, and then finally you've got an offsetting strategy. So that's basically how we're defining net zero carbon. And we're going to then discuss that in just a moment. So I'm just going to run a couple of polls. And so, Katerina, if you could bring the polls up. And we just got an open question initially around the question of the discussion. And we're going to answer this question at the end, by the way. So we've got a before and after, and I'm looking for progress.
Are we saying yes, it's reality, or no, it's not reality?
No, so reality or mirage? So is it a mirage? Yes, it's a mirage. Okay. Yes, it's a mirage. Yes, it's a mirage. No, it's not. Yes, it's a mirage. Okay. And we got not sure. Oh, that's great. We got this is live interaction. We like this, don't we? So that's kind of interesting. I mean, it's good. You know, we've got a few not sures, and when you add the not sure to the yes, it's a mirage, actually it's more than 50%. So panel, we have a challenge ahead of us. Okay. Okay, let's do the next poll, and this is going to be a kind of one of those word sort of collages. Okay. So the next question is, what are the biggest challenges to achieving net zero carbon? So put in a word, 2 words. Try and keep the words short, 2 or 3 words, and we'll slowly build up a picture about what the biggest challenges are. I'm going to pick some of these up in the discussion later, because we'll then bring this back up. And in terms of any questions that come up, please do. So we've got some emerging things here. Look, right at the centre, I guess what you would expect amongst BCO cost is right at the top. And I think we're going to need to tackle that panel. Finance cost, understanding behaviours, concrete, so we've got a bit of embodied carbon coming in here. Legislation or lack of it, perhaps. Rent, green energy, it's moving around. Great, keep that up. So let's stop now. In fact, take photographs of it, please, and tweet it, because, and if we can keep that ready for the end, Katerina, that'd be great. So I'm going to introduce you to our first panelist speaker, and that's going to be, Adam Smith. So Adam Smith is from Stanhope. Adam, over to you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. Also, thanks to Peter Williams for stealing all of our thunder in the previous session. Hopefully, we'll try not to repeat too much of what was already said. When we rehearsed quite quickly our panel discussion today. We were all very conscious that we may well overlap and say similar things. So I'm going to try and stay in my lane. I'm here to give the developer's view, and the other members of the team will be giving the designer's view and from an asset management and portfolio view on Jane's behalf. So I think from a developer's point of view, it's all pretty real. It's got pretty squarey pretty quickly, and the market dynamics really say it all. You're probably, I'm not claiming, these are other people's statistics, by the way, but there's some pretty big numbers here about how important it's become to occupiers and owners and investors to be able to get a handle on their carbon emissions and be able to disclose them accurately, because that's what their investors, shareholders are demanding, and their employees. I think that's all pretty indisputable. So aside from the science, I think we've got past the point now where we were all arguing whether climate change might or might not be real, but now also the money is talking. So the first thing I thought I'd bring up in terms of the mirage metaphor that Guy has helpfully come up with is, well, maybe what we should be talking about is whether there's some emperor's new clothes going on and whether or not we can actually define what we're trying to do. So apologies if the text is a little bit small, and Guy did give me a telling off for this, but I sort of stuck to my guns. I'm just going to talk through some technical things here very quickly about the path to net zero to demonstrate that potentially there are, I'm not saying anyone in this room, there are some people out there on the developer side claiming net zero buildings perhaps a little bit too soon. I think my personal view is that a net zero building is not really a net zero building until sometime after completion, and you can actually demonstrate what you've done. And I think it's actually quite dangerous to be marketing buildings as net zero before you've got there. So working along the top, there's the notion of low carbon construction below recognised national benchmarks. And I think there's a huge amount of work going on benchmarks. What does low carbon in construction look like? And there are some emerging leaders in the thinking there, UKGBC, LETI, and so on, and REBA 2030. But there's more work to do, and it's got to be driven by the data. But some people would argue that in order to get to net zero construction, you've got to get the lower thresholds before you can start talking about offsetting. And that's the second column. Construction's emissions correctly offset. That's a whole lecture series of its own I'm not going to go into, but something that from a developer perspective we're spending a lot of time doing our due diligence on. Operationally efficient buildings, recommended neighbours 5-star. There are no neighbours accredited buildings in the UK yet. People are beginning to market their buildings as neighbours 4-star, 4.5-star buildings. I think at Stanhope we think that's pretty dangerous, and that we will be actively pioneering our neighbours projects as hard as we can. But until we get there, there's a lot of work to do. And I think UKGBC's advice is that for our operational energy in our commercial building stock to be at parity with the grid's level of renewable electricity forecast in 2030 to 35, we need to be getting down to the neighbours 5-star buildings. Apologies if you haven't come across neighbours yet, by the way, but please grab me afterwards if you'd like to have a chat about it. Renewable energy purchased through REGOs with no additionality. People claiming net zero buildings because they've got REGOs. REGOs are great, but unless they're actually creating additional renewable energy to what's inherent in the supply, I'm afraid from our perspective we don't think that's net zero. Which is the next column, REGOs or similar with additionality. And then on the right, back to this neighbours thing, design for performance, making sure that we're not just producing a highly efficient building in theory, but in practice, the FMs and the occupiers are monitoring it to maintain a certain level of performance. So just kind of crack on, because I know I've got limited time. Mirage or reality, or are we going to end up with a camel? I think it's a really helpful metaphor in some ways, because we are on a journey and we've got to trust the map, and that there is some way of getting there, even if it is cleverly concocted and a little bit, to some people, a bit opaque. I think those of us, there's something going on with the software here, sorry. It's a bit of a sizing issue going on. But we're pretty clear now, thanks to UKGBC and others, about what we've got to do in construction and in operation. Apologies for the formatting. If you're not sort of, a lot of you are probably more expert in this than I am, but if you're not familiar, then I would commend you to the UKGBC Net Zero Carbon Framework definition, because that's what we're all using. So how are we doing on this journey? Well, I think we're probably in the foothills, if I'm really candid. We are really getting a handle on measuring and estimating the embodied carbon that we're anticipating our developments to use up. And we're looking at the emerging industry benchmarks as to how we're faring. And we're in 2021. By 2030, we need to be right down on that trajectory. What's clear from this graph is that, from an embodied carbon, no surprises, refurbs do really well. And if you're a portfolio developer, the argument is whether you're looking at buildings net zero one by one or on a portfolio basis, but I'll leave that potentially to Jane to talk about. And then similarly on operational carbon, a long way to go. Sorry, the dots have disappeared. I don't know what's happening, but the key message here is that high-rise is difficult from an operational perspective, and refurbs and mid-rise are probably the answer for the future. Oh, sorry, they have popped up. So quickly, because I've only got 10 or 20 seconds left. Headwinds, what's challenging us? Land values, it's encouraging high-rise in some areas. Timber, looking pretty difficult. Insurance industry really not helping us, but there's a lot of us trying quite hard over there. Occupier and agent expectations, they all want it, but they don't necessarily understand it fully yet, and we've got to really work collaboratively. There's a real prevalence of high carbon materials in facade systems, not helped by the timber situation. And I think also we've got to get really focused on this offset issue, because you can't be net zero without a degree of offsetting in construction. and the cost of carbon is only going to go one way. Challenges to the BCO, just very quickly, discourage the hype, educate ourselves, our colleagues and our customers, be critical about what we really need, don't over-specify, be strategic, and don't be gulled by 60-year operational benefits when we need to reduce carbon now in the next 30 years. That's what the RICS guide is telling us to look at 60 years, but I personally think that you've got to be really careful about putting loads of extra aluminium into buildings to make them more operationally sustainable. I'm going to hand over quickly to David because I think I've gone over. Sorry.
Thanks, Adam. Hello, everyone. 5 to 7 minutes, right, Guy? Okay. Oh. Okay, well, let's start then. All right, so I'm going to have a go at this without slides. Gosh, I wasn't expecting that.
Just hold on a second.
No.
You're happy with that? You always drop the slides in if you want.
Yeah, but I was the naughty one who sent them last, so, it's okay. I'll have a go. Oh, come on, don't boo. Right, so reality or mirage? I think sort of mirage. I think really carbon is a theoretical construct, right? And it's all about getting us to perform better. And in that sense, there's no harm in it being a mirage. So, of course, and it's a mirage in a few ways, right? So carbon, first of all, in case you didn't realize, is actually a proxy for a whole load of things, right? So it's a proxy for all greenhouse gases converted to a sort of normal benchmark of carbon. So it's slightly invented in that sense anyway. And the awkward thing is you can't meter carbon. It's not like water or power, or you can't meter it. So you have to have some kind of construct for calculating it. So I think it is a bit of a mirage. And worse still, there's a great quote from Paul Finch who says, if only carbon stank. You can't kind of grasp it, right? So it is a bit of a mirage in that sense. The other is net zero, at some level, is all about boundaries, right? Where do you draw the boundary to which you're going to try and apply net zero? And I think there's an interesting challenge here where perhaps we should be starting to include bits of our house in the net zero carbon calculation because we're working from our homes so much now. So I think boundaries are interesting. UK GBC definitions do a great job of pulling in a definition that we can all work to. So the target is pretty clear. We've got a 2050 deadline as a nation to hit zero carbon. And incidentally, the thing about the grid becoming carbon-free only happens if we reduce demand. They are not kind of separate things. So by 2050, we've got to pull all of that together. I'm just going to mention 6 things that I think, are kind of challenges for us. So the first is data. We have got a lot of data now, an increasing amount of data. We still haven't pulled all the information out of that data, right? So embodied carbon especially, we've got lots of numbers, but we're still in the process of learning from those numbers and actually getting the targets right. So you'll see lots of numbers from LETI and REBA 2030 and UK GBC, and they're great because they set a benchmark for us to aim at, but they're probably not right yet. But they set us on the road, which is fantastic. But I think we're still in that process of learning and upskilling. So I had a couple of great slides about variability here. So in the calculations we do on embodied carbon, the variability in different categories is still quite significant. I'm by trade an MEP engineer, and the MEP discipline is probably the least certain of all. We really don't know what the embodied carbon is of a lot of the MEP components in our buildings, and some of those are quite significant numbers. So there's another bit of learning there, and I think we're starting to get there now. We're understanding weights of material and production energy. But we still see a plus or minus 30% variation in MEP quite easily. But that will gradually clear. One of the big focuses for embodied carbon is the primary structural material. We've all fallen back in love with timber again, which is fantastic. And taking Adam's 30-year thing, or short term, timber really is a fantastic material. I think there's a question about whether it stands the 100-year test of time, because does it last forever, and can you do something sensible with it at the end of the building's life? And that's somewhat untested. But as an immediate hit, timber is great because you sequester carbon. But that's not to ignore the other materials, and we do a lot of work diving into concrete and steel as well. If you take a very long building life, you design carefully with concrete, you test the flexibility and resilience to change in use, then concrete can make a lot of sense if you've got good GGBS content and you drive the embodied carbon on it as low as possible. The whole life carbon picture can make sense. And steel, of course, of all of the materials, is probably the one that you can take apart and reuse most easily if it's reasonably standardized. So timber is not always the answer, but it's a fantastic opportunity that we should be doing our best to take, notwithstanding fire and water ingress and things, which are technical issues we need to work past. On the operational side, two big things for me. The first is we really need to make the landlord-tenant relationship work. It's in everybody's interest for buildings to perform at their best when they're occupied, and for that to happen, the two have got to be really intertwined. It can't be a separated relationship. So I think that's something for us to focus on really hard. And the other that Peter mentioned when he was speaking is facilities management. So I think we really have to treat the FM trade as a proactive, critically minded, respected and rewarded role in our process, because they are actually the beating heart of our buildings. They're the ones who will make our buildings operationally work. Doesn't matter how good our design is, if the people operating the building don't get it, then it's all for nothing. So I think they're massively important. You know, this will come up again and again. The final piece is offsetting. And I think at the moment, this one probably genuinely is a mirage, actually. So the European Commission, I don't know if you remember them, they audited some of the UN's offsetting schemes, and they found that less than 5% of the offsetting schemes were actually genuinely, authentically additional. And I think that is, as Adam said, our big challenge, is finding certified offsetting that really is additional capacity and not just something being rebadged. And so, very finally, I think I must admit that I am always led back to the reinvention of buildings rather than new buildings. I do wonder if the whole net zero agenda that we're generating for ourselves is a kind of tidy way of us carrying on doing what we've been doing for quite a while with a slightly clearer conscience now. And actually, the real thing we need to tackle is let's try and really build new buildings less and really reinvent the building stock we already have. And I wonder, you know, in Switzerland, in Switzerland, you actually have to prove your case to put cooling into a building by law. And I wonder when the time will come for us when we actually have to prove the case to demolish a building, really prove it, not just kind of pay lip service to the proof, but really prove that we have to demolish something to build something new rather than reinventing what's already there. Thank you.
Afternoon, a room full of scary people. Right, next. This is quite simple, even I can do this. Right, so I know it's not a mirage, but I quite like the image. It's really difficult to find an image of a real mirage. Surprisingly. Right, so mine's going to be more of a story about a journey. So designing and constructing buildings is complex. The real estate building is complex, way too complex for an architect. Solving the climate crisis is complex and complicated. So it's no great surprise you put them all together and most of us get a real bad headache. But as a society, we do complex. We do complicated. We do difficult all the time. Flight's difficult, brain surgery's difficult, building Crossrail's difficult, and even that will get finished at some point. We do difficult when we agree that the benefits of an endeavour outweigh the cost and effort, however complex or complicated that might be. We invest time and energy and money into working out how we can do it. And if we're going to meet our commitments under the Paris Agreement, let alone COP26, we know we need to make huge strides in delivering net zero carbon buildings by the end of this decade. So what's that got to do with it? Well, in 1961, JFK announced to the world that America would put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. So a bit like our challenge in the next 9 years. The US had only been doing the space program for 6 years at that point, so that was a hugely ambitious promise. Just as with the space race, we need to explain why and how we're going to deliver net zero carbon buildings and how we're going to pay for it. JFK didn't have any problem convincing the American public why, they just wanted to beat the Russians. But whilst most people understand the need to do something to save the planet, our only home, they need convincing that they actually need to do something about the climate crisis, because it impacts on us personally, with behaviours and financially. So we have all got our part to play in telling that story. JFK didn't need to explain how. He couldn't, probably. He just had those very clever people at NASA to do that for him. On the other hand, again, we need to explain how we're going to do this so people believe it's possible. And we'll see whether I think that at the end. JFK just magicked money out of the thin air to pay for the space program, just as governments have done that for the COVID crisis. If they could only magic some of that money out to help us with the climate crisis, I think we'd be moving in a really good direction. So we're quite a long way further advanced on our journey to net zero, I think, than NASA were in 1961. We just need to get a plan together to do that, to achieve that goal. We've tested individual parts of the solution and designed many others. We just now need a huge impetus to drive that initiative. As an architect, I'm involved with and see some really good examples where good is being developed. Whether this is buildings with timber structures which sequester enough carbon to offset other construction materials, or advances in off-site manufacture that help deliver the construction quality required for airtight buildings, or whether it's collaboration between whole design teams where they balance competing drivers to deliver net zero carbon in use, and many other examples. But none of these projects deliver perfect. Each tests a part and pushes a boundary in a specific area. We need to be sure that we now have a plan to bring all of those individual parts together into a coherent whole to meet the objective in the timescale. But does that plan involve improving and tweaking what we already know? Or do we need something radical? Do we need a change in technology and behaviours? As an industry, we're subject to external factors and forces. These are now pushing from two directions, from regulation and from user demand. We need those to come together in the same way they have for cars, where the government financially incentivises us to switch to EVs, whilst simultaneously increasing taxes on petrol and diesel cars. This is creating conditions for what was once a niche product, an electric vehicle. It's turned it into a status symbol, where the green flash on the number plate has become the latest must-have accessory. An equivalent step change for buildings is needed, where nobody wants to own or live in or work in the latest gas-guzzling car, building even. But is that enough? The car on the left is a new Audi, supposedly designed from the ground up as an EV, but it looks just like a standard Audi SUV, except it won't drive quite as far between refuels. It's using the same brief and coming up with something very familiar. The car on the right is a new car being developed by River Simple, which has been designed truly from the ground up, but in a very different way. The brief is different. The car is smaller. It's not over-designed like most modern cars and most modern offices. It's made from lightweight materials to increase range. It runs on hydrogen, so no need for scarce materials to be mined to put in batteries, and it can be refueled in minutes. The designers and manufacturer are offering this as a service, including the fuel. It's something you rent, you don't buy it. So they have a massive invested interest in getting everything absolutely right, otherwise they lose out. So do we need something similar for office buildings, something truly breaks the mould? I suggest that we need both to continue refining and improving what we know, but simultaneously re-examining everything about our brief and developing truly new solutions. And we need this, as everyone else is saying, for refurbishment just as urgently as for new build, possibly even more so. buildings again. So as someone who had their interest in sustainability awakened over 35 years ago as a student at the Centre for Alternative Technology, when I could see the fuzzy outlines of what was then sustainability as our Mirage, I can see that gradually firming into a plan which can deliver, I don't say it does at the moment, but it can deliver the reality of those net zero carbon buildings. And along that journey, we must not let the pursuit of the best be the enemy of delivering good on that journey. Thank you. And on to Jane.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, voice a bit croaky. So my name is Jane Wakiwaka. I'm from the Crown Estate, and I'm here to give you the landlord perspective. So I'm very much focusing on our existing buildings, although we do developments as well. And worth noting that alongside a number of our real estate peers, we've committed to becoming a net zero carbon business by 2030. Although the caveat is we have made that commitment not knowing fully how we're actually going to achieve our 2030 target. So one of the things I just kind of wanted to reflect on as a landlord is that we are having to sort of operate in quite a rapidly evolving and sometimes a very fragmented landscape. And just to give you sort of a snapshot of some of the things that we're having to consider, not only are we thinking about different types of legislation at national, regional, local level, which is very much pushing us towards focusing on performance, but we're also thinking about how industry is evolving. And we've had some sort of great examples from UK GBC, Letty, for a real estate owner, the BBP climate change commitment is a really great way of focusing on existing buildings, and a number of real estate companies have committed to that BBP climate change commitment. We're also seeing quite a lot of movement amongst other sectors that have an impact on our occupiers as well, such as the BRC's retail sort of commitment to net zero, the finance sector taking quite a lot of interest, wanting a bit more disclosure and transparency in terms of how buildings are performing. So there's a lot of change that's happening from a landscape point of view, and we expect that that's going to continue to evolve, but it's all going to sort of push and drive us towards achieving net zero. One of the things that really wanted to kind of highlight was the importance of focusing on existing buildings. And I think David's kind of mentioned, thinking about how we sort of repurpose our existing assets. The 80% figure that's up there is probably quite well known to you. And I think a lot of the debate around net zero has tended to focus on new developments and major refurbishments, but I do think that we need to really start to focus more on what we actually do have. And I also wanted to call out specifically conservation and heritage buildings, partly because of what we own in terms of Regent Street and other sort of heritage assets. But the quantum of heritage buildings that we're looking at is over 10% of all buildings that currently exist, and that equates up to 55% of the UK's total emissions. So we need to really think very carefully about how we look and manage our historic buildings as well. And some of the things that we're looking at is how do we start to get better alignment between heritage policies and energy conservation policies as well. As David mentioned, for us, customers are a huge, huge part of the overall picture. And just in terms of an overall sort of quantum, at least 2/3 of our operational energy is actually associated with tenant use. So it's absolutely fundamental that we do work very closely in collaboration with our occupiers. But then if we start to building things like fit out, which is a huge part of the embodied carbon of existing buildings, and if you think about multi-occupancy buildings, if we're looking at those types of buildings, we can expect up to 30 to 40 different fit outs over the building life cycle. So embodied carbon doesn't actually just end at construction. There is a huge embodied carbon associated with existing buildings as well. But at the same time, we're also knowing that with our customers as well, increasingly, a lot of other organizations are committing to net zero, and especially in the run-up to COP, what we're finding is that the number of companies that are committing to net zero have actually increased threefold between 2019 and 2020, and we expect that to continue to increase. So there's a real sort of demand for net zero, especially in buildings that these organizations are occupying. Some of the work that we've been doing has been trying to explore what does net zero mean within an existing building, and we've been doing some scenario modeling just to understand what we can actually achieve. And what we have found is that there are some general trends and themes that we can really hit in terms of getting to net zero. There's about 25 to 30% are still easy win measures that we can all be doing to achieve net zero on those existing buildings. But what we have to recognize is that it isn't necessarily a one-size-fits-all. And what we've been trying to do is sample different buildings to understand what are the sort of types of things that we might be needing to consider. So in some buildings we do have gas, in others we don't. Some buildings are limited in terms of the types of renewables that we can put in. So these are some of the things that we have to start to consider as well. I think it's also important that we consider things in a holistic way as far as practical. So we can't just look at carbon in isolation with other factors. So a good example of that is looking at openable windows. And given a lot of our assets are in London, we have to also consider how that impacts from an air quality point of view. So having to think about different sort of impacts is really crucial as well. And I think lastly, some of the things that we're really considering is the practicalities of actually delivering some of these implementation measures. For a new development, it kind of is a bit easier because you don't have any occupiers in situ, but where you have a multi-occupancy building, what we're trying to do is think about how do we sequence some of these measures. So we have to work really closely with not just our FM teams, but our asset management teams, thinking about when spaces are occupied or how do we minimize disruption to existing occupiers as well. I think the last thing that I just kind of wanted to sort of focus on was the importance of the landlord-occupier relationship, which David mentioned. And I think, again, in the past, there's been a bit of focus on green leases. And I think while that's a really useful mechanism, green leases isn't just going to drive net zero. So it's how do we use green leases in the most effective way possible. Also thinking about the impact of digital and technology. I have to say data for our customer procured energy is pretty poor, so we see digital and technology as a way of really easily overcoming some of that. But we also think that digital and technology will help to challenge the way that we actually procure some contracts in terms of how we approach repairs and maintenance going forward, and how do we actually measure end-use experience and end-use performance as well. We're also beginning to think about different approaches to fit outs. And I think one of the big challenges is, do we really need to have everything to Cat A, for example? So how do we look to sort of dematerialize fit outs going forward? Do we actually provide a certain degree of fit out just so that we're reducing the amount of waste that's generated when we're changing occupancies? I think one of the real challenges that we're facing right now, and it kind of very much depends on the lease lengths, is how do we identify mutual co-benefits? So it's not just about identifying who pays for it, but who actually benefits for it. And I think just really lastly for me, it does require ongoing and consistent engagement. It's not just kind of when you market a building and just let it, you do need to continue to engage. And I think as a consequence, we rely heavily on our managing agents, our facilities managers, but also having a really positive relationship with our customers, because we know as a landlord, we can't deliver net zero carbon buildings on our own. I'm going to pass back to Guy now.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Please come up, that would be great. If you could fire in your questions, we've also got a roving mic. If I can just get this, 7, 8, 7, 9. Yeah, we've got a roving mic going around as well. And Katerina, could you bring up that list of challenges, please, that everyone sort of noted earlier. So I'm going to start off with a few questions, and then I'll open it up to the floor. And if some questions come in, I'll take them on here. Otherwise, I've got 6 questions, which is great. There's also a mic, as I said. So I think do you know what was amazing about all of your presentation? First off, you all kept to time. So thank you very much indeed. That was great. And what was refreshing about it is that we have an architect showing other people's buildings. Amazing. We have an engineer talking without slides and without any graphs. And then we see the graphs and all the science being shown by the owner and the developer. And you ask yourselves, actually, whilst our buildings don't seem to have changed that much, the people who are driving our buildings, designing them, procuring them, have changed enormously. And I'd just like you to reflect on that for the moment. You know, you look at developers now, and we've got people like Jane and Adam, sorry, Adam, mostly forgot, who are really on top of the science. And yet, I look around the world of architecture and the world of buildings, and we know there's a code red. we've been told, and yet it all looks the same. I mean, where's this change coming? We saw it, John, in the car. You know, there's a fundamental difference. You got it right with the, you know, just redesigning an SUV to fit batteries, and then you've got River Simple, which is totally I don't see that redesign from the bottom up in buildings at the moment, and I'm just wondering why that is and when we're going to get serious about it. So I'll kick off with you, Adam, and then we'll jump to just go around just to have a bit of a discussion around that.
I think that's a really good point. And, you know, I think what's interesting is, you know, it's a bit like road users. You know, the drivers don't like the cyclists, lorry drivers don't like anybody. You know, we're in a bit of danger in our industry of saying, well, he's not making the move and the client's not asking the right questions, or my architect's rubbish. You know, there's a lot of finger pointing going on. I was at a facades conference for my sins last week, and, you know, talking about sustainability, it's a bit of an anathema. You're a room full of people who want to sell you aluminium and glass. You know, we have got to change aesthetic preconceptions of what we want, and I think we're in a really good moment actually where we can have these conversations, but we are still getting a little bit of inertia around that client and architect and owner and engineer first move, where the brief isn't quite freed up to talk about these strategic things.
Yes, okay, it's part of the brief, and it's into the materials as well,
but I think also, you know, we are used to building buildings which are lots of glass, lots of aluminium, of, you know, the systems and supply chains aren't there to do anything different yet. And I think it requires the imagination of our client briefs and our architects and our facade designers and our suppliers to come forward a bit more.
Let's pick up that system and the design piece, John, and then I'll come to David and Jane. Well, this design, the systems you're just kind of following the old supply chain, you're not really challenging it. Great, you're using wood, but it's kind of just replacing steel at the end of the day, isn't it?
I think the challenge is twofold there. I think we're not getting enough push from our clients because they're not getting enough push from end users. And I think you know, I brought up the analogy with the car industry. That's dominated by a small number of very large players who can invest huge amounts of money in R&D to drive towards a very small number of products. We're almost the opposite. We have a huge number of suppliers and actually a massive number of different products. So we don't have that. We kind of, to my mind, it needs someone like Elon Musk to take on buildings. You know, he is a maverick, and, you know, love him or loathe him, he has changed the way people thought about cars. I don't think Audi and Ford and everybody else would have been following into electric vehicles had he not done the work that he'd done. We kind of need a Stanhope or a Crown Estate to really stick their neck out and go for it, probably. Okay. I think that's the only way that you'll drive it, because everybody else is just looking around and looking over their shoulder, and you just have to do a little bit better than the next guy, and you're okay.
Okay, so just, Jane, why don't you pick that up? He just laid down a challenge to you. We need Crown Estates to grab hold of this by the scruff of the neck. And another excuse coming out of an architect, oh, it's the brief. I mean, you know.
Never our fault.
I mean, I have to say, when we set out our net zero carbon commitment, it's really changed the type of conversations that we are having within the organisation. And I can't remember who said it, but we're now having to justify if we are going to do a development going forward, or if we're going to do a refurbishment. So it's definitely in our thinking, because we're thinking about how we make decisions beyond financial value, but what is the opportunity from an environmental and social point of view. So, and I do think that there's other organisations that are out there that are really trying to push the boundaries. What I would say is that the real opportunity for us is how we collaborate together as a sector, and you know, Adam and I and a number of our peers kind of do try and work together, because we're trying to solve quite common issues and challenges. And the more that we can kind of collaborate, then we're all able to sort of grow as an industry and a sector as well.
So for instance, talking to Stanhope, and so you're collaborating with fellow owners, investors, developers, whatever it might be, yeah? Collaboration. David, do you want to just pick any threads from...
Well, so I guess the couple of things that struck me, one is you know, the idea that you change the shape of a car because it'll be more efficient. You know, if you go to Germany, they design much narrower plan buildings generally, and they do it so that they're superbly daylit and naturally ventilated. But we're constrained in a lot of our urban environments from doing that just by the geography of sites. Not always, but so I think there's a kind of limit to how much we can change the form. I mean, I'll just say this, at some level, I don't actually, you know, the fact that visually the buildings aren't changing, I'm not sure I care about that really. I'm not sure it has a big impact. I think there's a big thing around the materials we use, you know, and it is unfortunate.
So look, okay, you don't care.
No, I don't
Are
care.
buildings revolutionising? Do you think anything radical has happened in the past 5 years in buildings?
Yes,
You
yes.
do? Okay.
So I think the whole UK GBC framework and the neighbours piece that's coming in are radicalising. That doesn't mean they're going to change the way buildings look necessarily. I think it will encourage us to use some more interesting materials if we can get over, you know, all the issues we've got with timber. I think it'll make a big difference. At some level, you know, the envelope of the building needs to be about letting daylight in and air in, and that's not going to change drastically.
I mean,
then there are other materials that I think that need investment, right? So composites, biocomposites, whatever, recycled materials being used much more in the structure and envelope. So I think those things need to come. I don't know if that means that the buildings look different. I think they're just materially different.
yeah, okay. I mean, it's interesting, and I think we'll come back to this in a moment, but the issue about, you know, shape and form.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, about the size of the site, but it's going to be land values and it's going to be, you know, cost and all that sort of stuff. I'd like to just drift into a debate around existing buildings versus, and this whole challenge around whether or not we should just never knock a building down if it exists already. You know, is that, and how do we ensure that the first sort of stroke of an architect's pen is to cross out the existing building, create a nice flat site, and then double the height and double the mass and all this sort of stuff. Adam, how do we, because you're always about new buildings generally, Stanhope, you know, so you've built your...
No, when you saw our graphs earlier...
Go on, tell us.
I think probably, I mean, I couldn't tell you by aerial construction value at the moment, but if I just go around our current projects, we're edging on towards 50% refurbs, I think. In fact, some of our most successful, some of the projects we're most proud of at the moment are, you know, the recent, we went back to Gresham St Paul's, the Schroders headquarters, and there was a building Stanhope built in the 1990s, and we've added a couple of floors, but it's largely a major refurb. Similarly, there's the old IBM building we're working on. You know,
and are these carbon decisions, or are they other decisions?
No, I think we've always looked at whether demolition is a good idea. Carbon is another reason to look at it harder, but there's some obviously viability and planning cone view issues as well, particularly in the city. But definitely we are having very sharp conversations at new business level to say, here's a site we're bidding on. The other party is going to be knocking it down. Are we going to knock it down? And we're often saying, no, we're not. And we're going to take that risk of losing that bid. Obviously, we don't lose bids, but we will risk losing a bid to do the right thing. Okay. You know, and I think carbon is, you know, for all of the people who invest with us in land, it is now becoming one of the first questions on the fund manager's lips.
Okay, interesting. Jane, I mean, this is plainly the portfolio that Crown Estates has I think I've very high percentage of existing buildings. And key to this, as you pulled out in your presentation, is engagement with the occupier, because you can't really touch the fabric that much, plainly. So it's all about operational, how you engage with the tenant and the occupier around the operational carbon. So what's your, tell us a bit more about the challenge you're facing around that.
I mean, I think the main challenges that we're facing is that we have a huge number of different types of customers across the portfolio, and a large number of customers as well, you know, in the hundreds and thousands even. So having a scalable solution where we're able to engage with occupiers is really essential. This is kind of where we're relying very heavily on our managing agents on the day-to-day interaction. So the property managers and the FMs have that day-to-day, and it's not just us. So it's kind of our supply chain, and how do we make sure that they're engaging around maximising operational efficiencies, etc. We're also making sure that we're putting in the right processes in place. So how do we make sure that our lease structures are including green provisions, for example? So there's things like that which we're looking at so that we're able to scale up how we engage with occupiers.
So I'm just picking up on a question that's come in. Are you finding occupiers are willing to pay higher rents, service charges, to cover high costs of sustainable design? That assumes that sustainable design costs more, which we can come back to in a moment. But is there a premium or at least a willingness to pay?
We've had anecdotal evidence as opposed to sort of anything quantifiable to say that occupiers do look for certain sustainability credentials, and I think it has an impact on sort of reducing potentially void rates. So we have some sort of examples of that, but I think it's one of a number of different considerations. What I would probably say is that actually net zero in the long term is more going to be a hygiene factor. So
right, okay.
It's kind of avoiding obsolescence.
Just standard stuff, right, okay. Business as mainstream. What about you, John, in terms of just picking up on sort of the embodied, on the existing building piece? I mean, is this the end of architects as we know it?
We already do a huge amount of refurbishment, and I think we increasingly get briefs where people are actually buying buildings, and the question is, do we refurbish? Can we, add additional floors, improve the building as it stands, or do we knock it down? For some time now, the economics tend to stick with a refurb, partly because of the shorter time frame of our risk. But unfortunately, none of that at the moment is generally being driven by sustainability, and actually improving the fabric of that building isn't necessarily very high on people's agendas, but at least it's doing something.
And this is issue of cost. I mean,
there is the cost and
does it cost
the
more
value,
to do a sustainable building?
Yeah, you do more work to improve the fabric of the building, it's going to cost you more money. Right. And if you're not going to put that on the bottom line as a rent, why would you do it? To a degree. I think what you're saying about future-proofing those assets is the big thing. We deal with quite a lot of smaller regional developers who aren't going to hold the buildings. Actually, they need to be looking up to the investors who won't buy those buildings.
Yeah, the investors. I think you picked that up in particular in your presentation.
Well, I think
investors.
And Jane was sort of referring it to the risk of stranding, as you said, stranded assets, and the CREM tool that Jane flashed up is very much on fund managers' minds, because there's no point buying a building which will be unable to meet legislation in a few years' time. There's the sorry, someone's going to help me, but the legislation around EPCs for rentable assets coming soon. In a way, it's not can you afford or get a premium for a sustainable building? Well, you can't afford not to. And
so legislation has a really important part to play in all of this. Yeah, I mean, will developers take us there, or is it really a matter of legislation? David, what's your...
Well, I was going to offer a couple of observations. One is on the cost issue. There's definitely, we're at a point in time where if you want to use, more sustainably sourced steel, high-star steel, for example, the supply chain is such that is a bit more expensive at the moment. So there are additional costs, but those will kind of level out over time, one would assume. I think we're starting to see the planners beginning to ask the question about embodied carbon and existing buildings with a lot more strength and knowledge. So that's, I don't think they can force anyone into it necessarily, but it's coming. So, I would have thought we'll start to see planning authorities being much more tougher about it. And I think it would be good for us as an industry. I mean, one of the things I love about the last few years is we're suddenly at a moment where, as an industry, we've got ahead of legislation around things like, around operational energy especially. It would be great if we could get ourselves ahead of the legislation that I think will come around existing buildings. And I also wonder whether, the declarations of zero carbon that a lot of owners have made sort of lead them to the point where to maintain that position, they sort of have to look at refurbishment a lot more seriously, I think.
Okay, so we've just got 3 minutes left, I think. Okay, one quick question here, and then I'm going to ask you each, while we're doing this question, each to pick a word from there and just expand on it for a few moments.
Hi, Martin Smith, Bureau 4. My key question is the insurance market. You have to go through a 9-step process for CLT to get insurance. You've also got designers, the PI premiums have gone up by 4 or 5 times the amount. How do you expect the design teams to innovate without cheap insurance when clients are willing to pay the fees?
Let's just get one person answering the insurance issue.
I think the finance market's getting it in terms of investment, but not
dive
insurance.
into that. Okay.
So a lot of conversations going on about this amongst our peers and collaborative work. I know there's the whole G&T Mass Timber Forum, which is very helpful, but we are working on this. It is very challenging and nigh on impossible to get a large scheme insured as an asset, let alone dealing with all the PI issues. I think we've got to have a bit of faith that it will work itself out, but it's just a question of how many years, and some of the things that we've got to do to persuade the industry may involve things like mutuals or captives, where developers and investors and landowners go through the alternative risk transfer market to create their own product, and at which point you would hope they will see sense and do what their colleagues in Europe and America do. But it's a tall mountain to climb.
Okay, great, thanks. David, your word.
FM.
FM. Was it mentioned?
I can't see what's up there, so I'm just saying it.
Okay, it's not up there. It's cheating already. It's up there. Go on, FM. Reason is just why? 30 seconds.
Because I think the way we operate our buildings is every bit as important as the way we design and build.
Okay, that's really... John?
I'm going to say education.
Yeah.
I think you get a room full of people like this, there is a huge amount of knowledge here, but actually you talk to the average person and they don't really get it. And I think the more we talk about that widely and get it understood more widely, people will understand what they need to do.
Okay, good. Jane?
I'm going to say leadership, because I don't think we should be waiting for legislation, because that's there just to bring the bottom up, and we should really be driving the agenda forward and working together on this agenda.
Great, thanks. And finally, Adam.
I'm going to be controversial and say infrastructure, because we haven't talked about it, we're building designers, but massive amount of carbon in infrastructure, and it may be the answer to justifying tall buildings or more buildings in cities is demonstrating the arguments around efficiency of carbon and infrastructure.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for your contribution. Sorry I only got to one question, but I hope you enjoyed the debate. But let me please thank Jane, John, David and Adam for a really good discussion and for their presentations. So thanks very much indeed.
Thank you very much, everyone. There you are, Guy, your phone. And my sincere thanks to Guy, David, Adam, Jane, and John. A really fascinating discussion. Some great themes there. Some I was particularly struck by, and one got a round of applause, of course. Reuse, repurpose, don't rebuild, don't overspecify. The BCO was founded way back in 1990 because offices were being ridiculously overspecified in the 1980s. And we still need to think about these things. The reference to the Apollo mission, leadership, be bold. We need the right stuff. For anyone who hasn't read Tom Wolfe's magnificent book on the Mercury program, which predated Apollo, I commend it to you. We need people with the right stuff if we're going to tackle this issue. Right, we now have a tea break. Please make sure you're back here by 3:20 for our final session. Thank you.